I am struggling to start the recording. There we go. Thank you. So today we have one of our longtime consult members, Bobby Joe, who is going to be presenting for us. So Bobby Joe is a therapist in Iowa and an ADHD coach. Bobby Joe has created a CE course for people wanting to learn more about working with adult ADHD clients. I'm so excited that you're here today presenting for us. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. I'm just gonna go ahead and try to share my screen and hopefully I get that all set up okay. Um, yeah, I am excited to get to give back to this group because I've gotten so much from it in the last year or so that I've been participating. And so um, today I am going to talk specifically around kind of using polyvagal informed therapy, and I'll talk a bit about that intersecting with ADHD and some things that I notice of how number one, using polyvagal informed therapy can be helpful when working with clients with ADHD. Uh, as I don't know, kind of what background everybody has in that, my plan for today is to just kind of do some super quick overviews. Since we are limited on kind of what is polyvagal and what is polyvagal theory, what is polyvagal informed therapy, and then kind of speak to some of the pieces about how I see that it relates to ADHD, and some of the patterns that I notice. I want to name up front that there really isn't much out there about that specific intersection of kind of what are nervous systems exactly like for ADHDers from a polyvagal, view. And so some of what I'll share when we get to that is really just my own observations for the most part. And so I also am super open if we have time to hear from all of you about other things, that you have noticed. And I'm certainly not capturing all of that experience as a whole, and just have, some moments to touch on some highlights with that. So just to share a little bit about me and kind of my position in the world and some of the privileges that I hold. I am an ADHDer. I was diagnosed as an adult within a couple years after grad school. I am white, a cisgender. I'm the parent of ADHD children. I have a number of non-visible health issues that I deal with on a regular basis, as do many other neurodivergent folks. I was a first generation college student. I was labeled gifted as a child. I'm a person living in a larger body, was born and raised in the Midwest in the US, and I'm currently married and currently in a heterosexual relationship. Some information about my professional background. So I currently contract to provide therapy services with Emotional Health Partners, which is based in Waterloo, Iowa. Although I started working fully remotely, I live in Decorah, which is a small little town. And a few months ago, I actually started working subleased a space in town and have been working kind of half and half in person and virtual. I specialize in adult ADHD as well as trauma, and have certifications in both of those areas. I've been in private practice for 1 year. Prior to that, straight out of grad school, I worked for about 7 years in addiction treatment, working with a drug court program primarily, but also, some other populations within that. And then I shifted into working in the higher ed area and worked at a college in their counseling service department for about 7 years. And then that's where I just transitioned out of. So I've primarily always worked with adults professionally. When I made that transition into private practice about a year ago, I also simultaneously started an ADHD coaching and education business called Embrace the Muchness. I do individual coaching. I have a group coaching program for therapists with ADHD. I do some coaching for parents of ADHD children, and have been doing these professional development trainings. I'll mention a little bit more about that later. And then I also offer professional consultation services. So as you can see, it's got a lot of, ADHD flair to the things that I am doing, but I was privileged in my work at the college to get to do a lot of outreach and different kinds of things. And so it was super important for me when I made that transition, because I enjoy having that variety, and that keeps me really like passionate and interested to be able to kind of build myself a career on my own where I can kind of still do all those different angles and all of those different pieces. So we'll jump in and get started with kind of talking about what is polyvagal theory. And again, it's going to be super brief explanation because I could talk about each of these components for literally probably hours for each of them. But I also just want to name, feel free if you have, I try to do things more conversationally when I present. So if you have any questions that pop up, feel free to drop them in the chat, and Ellie will interrupt me if I'm not noticing them. And I'm happy to answer as we go. And I'll also try to leave some time at the end to check in about that also. So if you're not familiar with polyvagal theory, it was originated by Stephen Porges. He started off by studying heart rate variability, and then it kind of led into what it is today. It is sometimes called the science of safety, which I think is a really nice way to kind of look at it. It is a neurophysiological framework that helps us consider why humans act the way that they do. And it also helps us understand what's happening kind of internally when that's occurring. Some things to know about this is that the actions often that people may have are automatic and adaptive, and they're generated by our autonomic nervous system. And it really comes back to being about survival of our species. So I always like to use that backdrop that at the end of the day, we are all mammals. And so some of when we get into polyvagal stuff is literally about how does our species of human survive, right? And so some of the guiding principles of the polyvagal theory are that our body has a hierarchy of response. Again, that's kind of based on survival. So the goal of our body having responses to situations is to sense safety and risk. And this is always happening beyond our conscious awareness. And that piece is really important when you start getting into doing psychoeducation for clients around this, because so often people have responses to what they're experiencing and like, I don't know why I did this, and why would I respond in this way? That doesn't make sense. And so being able to help them have this foundation of a biological understanding and getting that they don't really get a choice sometimes in what kind of nervous system states their body goes into can be super helpful. So our body has what's called a neuroception. That just means that it perceives some kind of information. Neuroception happens, they use three terms: outside. So that's like things that are occurring in our environment, around us. So if I see a bear, that's the example I tend to use with clients. If I see a bear that is coming towards me, my body is going to perceive that and then have a response to that to try to keep me safe. That would be outside. Within, neuroceptions internally would be things like if I have an infection, my body is going to perceive that there's something there and then have a response in my nervous system in order to fight off that threat from that infection. And then between, which I just mentioned to Ellie, I actually was really glad that I did this presentation on this topic, because as I was having to put all this information and figure out what to include for all of you, it's really, really like solidified kind of my understanding of kind of things I think that have been floating around of how I view some of what happens for neurodivergent individuals. This between piece felt really important to me when I read this, because the between neuroception is based on our brain's ability to kind of notice the cues of what's happening between my interactions with other humans. And am I safe with that person, right? And so we can imagine once we start opening that door for conversation about all that could be happening there, right? And then the other kind of guiding principle of this is co-regulation. Our nervous systems are wired for connection. They're also wired again socially. So when somebody around me's body is moving into one of these different nervous system states because of survival, I'm going to assume, oh, if you're starting to panic, then I should probably be starting to panic because there's a threat around, right? That's super important for us to know as clinicians, because what does that mean? When our clients are dysregulated, our nervous system is also going to just automatically, beyond your conscious awareness, want to get dysregulated as well. But that the opposite is also true, and that's what's super, super powerful from a clinical perspective, is that if you can work on your own nervous system regulation, being able to provide co-regulation for folks when they are dysregulated is one of the most healing things that you can do. Because when you are emanating kind of that sense of safety and regulation, that their nervous system also will pick up on that and may start to move itself towards that. So those are kind of the three guiding principles of it. Most of you are probably familiar with all the different nervous system states. Again, could talk a long time about all the kind of theory around this, but we have ventral vagal, which is what they label as kind of the connection and safety, the regulated nervous system state. Then we have sympathetic, which is the fight or flight kind of state. We have dorsal vagal, which is sometimes called the freeze, or in some more advanced models, the flop state. And then I also wanted to name, for those of you who are familiar, most of us have probably heard of, fight, flight, or freeze. Some models add in kind of the flop and also the fawn response, which I think is particularly important when we start talking about neurodivergent folks. And so the fawn response is mostly categorized by people as kind of a mix of sympathetic and dorsal vagal states. And so we'll check in on that in a little bit. I want to acknowledge you are not likely to be able to read all of this perfectly right now. So I have a whole Google Drive folder that I have shared the link to, that has a copy of this. There's a document that has like just links to all the different resources that I kind of mentioned throughout here. So, and I'm just going to give a quick overview of this just in case people haven't learned that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to explain a brief version of kind of how I do psychoed about polyvagal theory to my clients. So even if you are somebody who's familiar, I know I love hearing different words and how people present things. And so I'm going to just kind of present it to you as I would present pieces of it, at least to a client, because that might be helpful if to either give you different language if you're already doing this, or if you want to start to do this. Hopefully that can be helpful as well. I also added into in my slides here, I just put a slide that kind of explains the process of how I choose to usually introduce this to clients. And it's definitely adaptive based on the individual, but like to give you some starting points, just in case that's helpful for folks if they're like wanting to start to do this or aren't sure, because I will name that it can be super overwhelming because there's just so much information about what's happening with the client. There's so much information you could share when doing psychoed. And so it's, if you are also neurodivergent, our brains don't like to know where to start and stop because it all feels important, right? And so you have to figure out what works for you. But generally how I start to kind of introduce this is often when my cue for kind of choosing to bring this up is either when I'm hearing like really clear patterns of clients about kind of nervous system states. They're usually not using that language, but I'm hearing that because that's the lens that I'm taking. Then I might ask if they would be interested in, kind of hearing about this. Or sometimes they'll say stuff like, well, I don't understand why I do this thing. I don't understand why when this happens, I do this. I also think it's great because most of the folks that I work with tend to like also just really enjoy learning about biology and some of those things too. So clients enjoy this. That's also why I love this particular visual, is that it's great for any clients. So you can simplify it or go as detailed as you want. The right-hand side has kind of all of the very specific types of physiological responses that the body is having. For most general clients, when you are doing psychoed, you don't need to go through all of these. Although sometimes, again, if I'm using an example that fits for them, I might pick out pieces of it and name that. At the same time, if you have a client who loves this type of thing, they might want to spend time like really diving into each of those things. But I also love that it has kind of just these like quick words to describe them. And so you can choose to use that kind of language with folks who maybe just need the quick overview and aren't like super sciencey based or don't need deep level understandings of things and just need like the quick reference. So that's just my kind of quick notes for you on that piece. So let's say that somebody brought this up and they agreed that they wanted to discuss it. I usually will either screen share if I'm seeing them virtually so they can see this while I'm talking about it, or in my office, I will usually have like a laminated copy that I can just kind of pull out and hand them that they can look at or glance at while we're talking about it. I know for me personally, I had learned a bunch of this stuff, and for some reason, it wasn't clicking for me until I saw like this graphic. I don't know why, but my brain was like really struggling with the levels. I also just want to name quickly for those of you who are familiar with the polyvagal ladder, this visual is set up opposite. So when you talk about the ladder, they flip that the social engagement is at the top of the ladder, meaning that if you are at the top, that you are stable and you are safe and you can kind of look out over everything. And if you're in sympathetic, you are moving up or down the ladder. And if you are in shutdown or collapse, you're at the bottom of the ladder. And I will also name, though, that the reason that I think I could never make sense of that is my brain got really stuck on the top of the ladder is not the safe place. That doesn't make sense to me, right? And so what I found is once I just learned it this way, it's really easy to just, if you're going to use any other resources with clients that reference the ladder, if you choose to use this graphic and share it with them, then you can just ask them to flip it. And then it's pretty easy to make that like that switch once they've learned it in that way. But so I just wanted to say that quick note because there's lots of different visuals that are out there that talk about polyvagal stuff. So when I'm describing to clients, I usually will just name that, again, humans are mammals, and so we're wired for survival just like any other species. So beyond our awareness, our body is always scanning for threats. I usually name that we perceive threats both externally, internally, and from the interactions between others. We have these three states that our body is always moving between, and this happens for everyone. That social engagement state is the one that we feel kind of calm, present in the moment, connected. In the sympathetic or the fight or flight state, that's where our body is giving us extra energy to either run or fight, whatever that threat is. And then we also have the freeze or shutdown or the dorsal vagal state. This is when our body becomes immobilized in order to try to shut down and conserve energy. So if we go and use an example of being attacked by a bear, if I'm just out in the woods enjoying the day, I'm likely in the ventral vagal state. And if all of a sudden I see that a bear start walking towards me, my brain's going to register that as a threat. And so it's going to automatically send a bunch of different signals to different parts of my body to help me move into a state that's going to give me the best chance to survive. So it's going to likely my heart rate and blood pressure are going to get increased so I can run away, which is flight, or fight, physically fight off the bear. It could also choose to move into the dorsal vagal or that freeze state where my body starts to become immobilized and I cannot move. And that happens for a couple of different reasons. Just like we know with other animals, there are some animals that play dead, where the hope with that is often that the animal that might be attacking you is going to find you uninteresting and just leave you alone, right? If it thinks you're dead, then it doesn't want to attack and it might just walk away. So that's one survival reason. The other is, let's pretend that maybe the bear has been, has started to attack me, and it's just clear that I cannot fight or run, my body may then just kind of shut down as many systems as possible to conserve my energy with the hope that I will survive and have to heal from that damage later. But again, the goal is always survival. And so I like to always acknowledge that just even if we think about like the last 200 years, think about how much our lives have changed as humans, right? Like there was a time where humans, not all that many years ago, where humans were probably facing a lot of like literal physical threats to them on a regular basis. Whereas now, for most of us, we may not have bears trying to, predators in that sense, trying to actively attack us. But it takes a really long time for our body to, change as far as on kind of a biological level. And so we still have all of these threat mechanisms that are really based on kind of animal instincts that then end up, a lot of the problems that we face in our day-to-day worlds are much more social and are much more kind of subtle sometimes. So our body doesn't know the difference between a response where, what if that person doesn't like me anymore, just a thought that I might have around that, versus the bear is attacking me. It goes into the exact same biological process either way. And so I just always like to kind of name that it's helpful for us when we think about kind of where that comes from, but also where we're at today and how it's still kind of showing up in the same type of way. The other thing is, because we're wired for connection, our body has that same process when it comes to our sense of safety socially as well. And so that's just another important kind of piece to note. So from here, every time I share that, of course, I give slightly different versions, but then I will usually move into trying to personalize this, what I've just shared with them. And, if they have any questions, I'll move into sharing, like seeing if we can personalize that in some way. So if there was an example that they just shared with me, then I will kind of go back and say, so it sounds like, when you said you had this, this kind of response in that situation, that your brain perceived that thing as a threat. And so then it went into this state, how does that sound for you? And then we just kind of have a conversation from there. Is usually kind of how that goes. I often will kind of check in with them about, asking the client just to notice, what do you think happens with your nervous system on a daily basis? What's that like for you? Are there any patterns that you notice? Which states do you feel like you spend the most time in? Is another question that I like to sometimes just start with to see, kind of where they land. And then obviously, however the client responds to these kind of things, then we just follow and kind of go from there. But so that's just a tidbit of how I tend to start to introduce this to clients, but it's also very specific with each individual. Yeah, Britt just asked, I know that I also love IFS, which I do. Can I connect this with parts language? Yeah, so in the shared drive, I actually shared, Ruth Culver has created a chart that kind of combines IFS parts language with polyvagal theory. So that's really beautiful if you have some IFS background, where I like to look at this as, if you're familiar with parts, I like to look at it as certain parts tend to live in certain states, right? And even if you're not super familiar with parts, most of you can get that. So my panic part obviously seems to live in the sympathetic state, or my depressed part tends to live in kind of that shutdown state. So a lot of the words that they have on here, you could just call those parts, because those are common parts that people name. There are some that it's a little bit more complicated with, like some of our thinking parts and things like that might not necessarily clearly fit into a particular state. But how I like to connect that for folks who maybe do, I do often work with both of these things with clients, because IFS is kind of the primary modality that I will use. But I also want to name that I feel like sometimes IFS doesn't doesn't necessarily directly recognize the role of the body quite as much as I would like for it to, as there's room to totally integrate that in that model, but it's just not kind of a core piece of the model as much as I would like for it to be. And so so I kind of use an integrated approach with using both of them. The other piece that I would say, Britt, is if you're somebody who's familiar with both of these, sometimes I find it helpful because I feel like that polyvagal can simplify some part stuff, especially at first if you're just working with somebody. While I love parts work, it can get to be really heady really quick sometimes in sorting them out. And so sometimes just being able to label, like, this is what state I am in, we can still identify and notice some of those patterns. And sometimes by doing some of the polyvagal work, then that can help us set the stage for the next step of like doing more part specific work.
Can I just say, Bob, I'm just so excited because my brain is the same. I realized same as yours. I try to understand polyvagal. I've read books. The science never makes sense, and you have finally helped it click in my brain. And so I am full of gratitude right now, and I can so see how I can integrate that with my parts language already. So thank you so much for getting time to explain IFS in this way.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I know, like, you're always free to message me because that's like, again, let's combine all of my favorite things. Like, I will geek out and talk with you about it. I do sometimes still struggle. Like Ruth's graphic is super helpful as a as a good starting place, but I just sometimes switch back and forth too, depending on what feels helpful in the moment with the clients, and be fluid about it, and they seem to be okay with that.
I could just really see how even it just provides some sympathy for some of those protector parts, like that we don't like, right? Like, it lives up there. Like, it's just another way to develop that self to part relationship. So again, like, I've learned so much from you just now, and my gratitude is so high because this is so exciting. So thank you.
It's super helpful. And as a quick example, I mean, I'm going to talk about application pieces in a second, but as a quick example, I just had a client yesterday who is probably ADHD, I think has ADHD diagnosis, likely autistic, probably also gifted, and so super heady, lots of thinking parts, and doesn't have much connection with self. And so we've been doing a great job of just kind of analytically talking about parts, and slowly I've been trying to get them to sink into like doing direct experiential work, right, with them, and we've had a little bit of some bumps with that. And so they said something last session that again triggered me to think like this would be helpful for this person, and I know they would absolutely love, like, they work in a biology world, like they would love this, right? And so I just started bringing this up, and so then we shifted, into talking about that, and then we agreed we're going to now do, I'll talk about this in a second, some mapping exercises that I think will be helpful for them for building their interoception skills that will set the stage so that they can better then engage in direct parts work with IFS. So so that's kind of then the next piece. So what is polyvagal informed therapy? I like to consider this as really just like a lens that you use. It's not a specific model, like that there is a guide for, but really more of just using this lens. So it means that the clinician is integrating the principles of polyvagal theory into how they conceptualize and into how they approach their work with clients. Deb Dana names kind of the 4 R's of this. So the goals are kind of recognizing the autonomic state, respecting the adaptive survival response, regulating or co-regulating into a ventral state, and then restoring. And so that's kind of that piece that Britt just touched on, is there can be a huge different story instead of I just froze and I did nothing when this trauma happened, and why would I do that? It's my fault, to, oh, my body was trying to help me survive and it just automatically took over in that way. And so, wow, can I have a lot of appreciation that my body helped me to survive? That feels so much different for a lot of people. So I'm not going to go through this again. I kind of verbally explained it, but I just put it into the slide so that you all have that as a takeaway. for later. So this is just kind of the steps of how I personally choose to, do some psychoed process around that. One of the resources that I have found super helpful is Deb Dana's Polyvagal Theory in Therapy book. As Britt was just saying, for me, so Stephen Porges's work, while he is the creator, he's more of a scientist. And so reading most of his stuff to my ADHD brain is very dry. And Deb really seems to be able to like explain things much more simply, but then also moves into application. And that's always what my brain is concerned about. I get super frustrated when it's like, okay, sure, I understand this. What the heck do I do with this information? Right. And so I think that it's really good. I will be honest, I probably, as per usual with books, I probably haven't read the book cover to cover necessarily. So I've just used it more as a reference and read pieces that I've found that have been helpful. There are a ton of exercises that are in this that are also super helpful. So if your clients need a lot of work and help to learn to regulate, there's a ton of different stuff to actually work on that nervous system regulation that's in there. But the piece that I use most from it is the mapping exercises that she has in there. So there is a set of 3 maps that she uses. So the first one is mapping what does it look like, feel like for that individual in each of these states. And so that's kind of a piece of that. I also, this is a side note, I want to be cautious that I'm not ever like, since there's some of her work in there, I'm not sharing that too much, but I created like a script for myself to prompt people as I'm going through those different works. So if you purchase the book and, have those things and you would like that, or that would be helpful for you. For me, it's just that like, if I don't do something regularly, my brain just forgets what those prompts are. And so I just have that so I can have that screen up to help prompt me as I'm leading the client through that. So if you have that book and are interested in that, just feel free to shoot me an email sometime, and I'm happy to share the links, at least for the first 1 or 2. It's just not really necessary as much by the time you get to the last one. So the second map then is looking at kind of what it's called triggers and glimmers. And so it's looking at what makes you move up and down, kind of what's the precipitating thing that creates that movement. And then the third map is regulating resources. So what are the things that when you are in a dorsal vagal state, what helps you to move into a regulated state? And one of the beauties that I love in doing this is that most of the time, by the time you get to the third map, and there's these different categories, I think it looks at what are things you can do by yourself and what are things that you can do with others. Most of the time, clients are able to come up with their own answers. And so I actually find I don't need to do a bunch of work with them around how to regulate themselves when needed, because they already have the answers. They just didn't know that's what they were doing until we've taken the time to really break it down. And if they do identify like, oh, I don't really know what to do to regulate myself when I'm in that stuck state, I don't know how to get out of it, then you can go to all the rest of like the resources in the book and then like work on building skills. But I love that you get to start this with a place of they probably already have the skills. And it's helpful. That's also empowering for them to see. So that's one of the ways that I then kind of use it in a more concrete way. And those are done really collaboratively. Your job as the therapist is just to kind of give some prompts around those things, but the client is doing the identifying of things. And I love that this is great for neurodivergent people because it's very personalized to them, their own system. So there was one video that I found that Stephen Porges directly talked about ADHD. And so in that video, he said, ADHD is really a state regulation disorder. And while I would not use the word disorder, I really would agree, right? So much of the label of ADHD is that like the name that we have for it is horrible. I think most of us would agree. It doesn't accurately describe what happens. But it really is about just difficulty regulating our systems. And then that shows up super specifically for ADHDers. It's difficulty regulating attention. because we have a hard time regulating what's happening inside and outside and all the different, input. It's difficulty regulating emotion. Others have said, it's kind of like having a Ferrari brain with bicycle brakes, with ADHD. And so it's just that there's a difference in kind of those brakes in the brain inherently, is a nice way to look at that. And so it makes sense once we start to think of it through that lens of kind of why there might be a lot of the different difficulties that folks with ADHD might have. So some things about why understanding polyvagal theory might be helpful for clients with ADHD is that it's non-pathologizing. Again, it's just your body is moving into different states. And the other reason that it's helpful is that regulation needs to happen first in order to utilize any kind of skills that take place in that prefrontal cortex of the brain. So that's all of our executive functioning skills. I forgot to mention this, but the other, if any of you are familiar with the hand model of the brain, I won't get into it for sake of time, but you can look up some videos on that too. That front part of your brain goes offline when we go into those fight or flight or freeze responses, because your body doesn't need to be making long-term decisions. It doesn't need to do stuff. It just needs to keep you alive, right? And so part of the key, and where sometimes other therapy models miss the mark, is if you're not simultaneously teaching regulation skills along with any kind of cognitive thought challenging based skills, they just simply can't be effective when somebody is dysregulated. And so this is also just true for basic executive functioning skills. You will have a much better chance at using those executive functioning skills if you are in a regulated state. So that's why it's particularly helpful. And then it really just opens doors to starting to have discussions about safety and masking. Once you kind of get through the basics of this, you can really get to deeper conversations about what feels safe for you and what doesn't feel safe, and how does that change your body. And so I think it can be helpful to set the stage for that as well. It's also my belief that being neurodivergent in a world with neuronormative expectations is in and of itself traumatic. And so I could talk about that for hours as well, but with that understanding, and I think that makes sense when we look back on this, right? If I am trying to perceive safety cues that are supposed to be innate, but often people that are neurodivergent don't act and respond in the same way, so they don't get those cues of safety from the people around them, and so they are constantly feeling unsafe, right? And so by that nature, then our nervous system is always going to be jacked up, being, watching and trying to figure out what's safe and what's not safe for me, and spending a lot of time and energy moving through those states because of that. So I think it's kind of twofold. I think there is something biological that makes our nervous systems be different, just biologically. And then I think that there's an additional layer that happens because of the experience of always being invalidated, always being told you're too much, you're not trying hard enough, you're not, not enough, you're too much, all those things over and over. Most ADHDers have immense shame. And so this can help to explain some of those responses. And then it also, to me, provides a model for working with RSD, or rejection sensitive dysphoria, because really, RSD, when we look at it through this polyvagal lens, makes a whole lot of more sense, right? And so that's just also something that I think can be really helpful as well. So some other general observations that I want to just kind of share that I have noticed that are maybe differences for ADHD nervous systems than maybe folks who don't have ADHD. The bulk of my work nowadays is with folks with ADHD, but when I was working at the college, I actually found doing polyvagal stuff super helpful during the pandemic. Because let's be honest, like that's when I kind of came to it, and that's when I started doing it, because I felt at the time I was like, I don't know what to do to help anybody with any of this. Like we're all just trying to figure it out, right? But what became really helpful is that I like about using this approach sometimes is it really doesn't matter. Dysregulation is dysregulation. So you don't have to know why you're in a dysregulated state necessarily. So just, can I just learn and focus on noticing when I'm in a state? And then can I assess if I need to be in this state, if it makes sense for me to stay in this state, or do I want to do something to regulate myself? And I think that's an important choice that I want to talk about too, is that a lot of therapy models focus so much on regulation, and that can just, that can feel really shaming to clients sometimes, that they feel like that they're just supposed to always be regulated. And even therapists are constantly trying to bring them down and not just allow them to have emotions. So that is not necessarily the goal here. A big piece of this is just first naming and noticing that you're moving into that state, and then you decide what you want to do about that. Just because I'm in a dysregulated state doesn't mean I have to regulate myself immediately. Sometimes it's serving a useful purpose, right? Like, the example I like to give is like, maybe I just lost somebody important to me and I feel sad. Sometimes I just need to spend some time in that shutdown state and just be there with those emotions and just be like that, because that's what my body needs, and that's okay. But it's also nice to be able to notice that that's what's happening, and make a choice that if I want to regulate, I have skills to be able to do that. So I always want to make that caveat that the goal isn't that you should only ever be regulated or it's wrong. It's actually more about, can we just notice and you can decide what makes sense and feels best for you based on your needs. So some things I notice is that for ADHD folks, ventral vagal often feels unfamiliar. Like many clients, when I do the mapping exercises, they have a really hard time with the ventral vagal, which I don't like using the word should, but like objectively, shouldn't that be the easiest one to describe, like the default kind of mode of being regulated? But most ADHDers I work with, like, sometimes really struggle to identify, like, I don't know what that feels like to be fully regulated and present. And so I just think that's an interesting thing to note. I also believe, and this is more of just my personal note, and this is where I encourage all of you to drop in some comments in the chats, because these are all just my observations and there's so much more, and your own experiences might be different. And to be honest, you're kind of the first group of people I'm like throwing all these things out there for. So parts of me feel a little bit nervous and like stating them in a concrete way, but like, I also feel like that ventral vagal might feel different for ADHDers. I know for myself, there are times that I feel feel present and connected, but my brain is still not 100% calm. I almost feel like there's like two different places with that. I have only ever felt like what I would say is a true sense of calm when I am doing yoga and in my own IFS therapy. Like, there is a difference between that, but I am able to fairly regularly reach this other level where I feel like connected and present, but there's still multiple thought trains there at all times. Those executive functioning differences, a pattern that happens, leads to sympathetic activation, and then usually eventually dorsal response, so task paralysis. And so like, because I might just naturally have difficulties with organizing and prioritizing, that automatically sends me into sympathetic, because I get worried about that, or I get stressed out about not being able to do that thing. And then often if you get too high, then you hit overwhelm. And then when people say I can't do anything, that's often a sign that they've moved into dorsal. Their brain got overwhelmed by whatever was happening, and then they get literally physically stuck. So that's a pretty common pattern and then it bounces back, that they drop down into sympathetic because they're like, now what, now I got to get all these things done. And so then it just keeps going. The other thing that I don't have a great read on is, I just really think hyper focus is kind of a mix of states. I don't think it fits well within the polyvagal model, and I don't quite know how to, I'm still trying to work on how to conceptualize that. For me, when I'm in a hyper-focused state, I can feel calm. I'm like, present. I'm very connected with whatever the activity is that I am doing, but it doesn't fit the traditional polyvagal model, because I lose all sense of internal interoception and all sense of external stuff. So if you talk to me, you're going to have to say my name 3 times. I will pretty regularly, sewing is one of my areas. If I'm working on a project, I will sit and like this for like 3 hours straight, not noticing how much time has passed. And then I will emerge from that with a serious pain in my body. And so polyvagal would say that is not, you know, if I'm that disconnected from myself, that is not a, that would not be considered kind of that social connected state or ventral vagal state. But at the same time, I actually feel very connected with what I'm doing. I don't necessarily feel like I'm in a, now this might depend on the person. I don't necessarily feel like I'm like in a pressured or anxious kind of state at all. And there's a sense of that immobilization, though, that's also happening, right? A lot of that lack of interoception happens with immobilization as well. And then I think I'm catching some of these notes here. Let's see. Britt said something about needing additional stimulation. So what I would say is that I just think that ADHDers need a dash of sympathetic activation to actually engage in task initiation. So not necessarily that they're regulated, but that we need to have just a dash, like just over the line. Because if it's too far over the line, then we also usually can't do the thing. But just a dash of it, which is why urgency works, right? And procrastination, because urgency creates a little bit of that, oh shit, I need to get this done, which gives us that stimulation to be, quote, productive, right? And so that's just another kind of thing that I have observed that I don't quite know what to do with and doesn't quite fit. You know, I think for most others, they tend to have the best chance to do the thing when they are in the ventral vagal state. But also sympathetic is about taking action. So it makes some sense that some sympathetic, you know, activation may be helpful. So those again are just kind of my like quick overviews of the pieces of, yeah, I see somebody talked about flow. I know flow state is that. I haven't been able to concretely find like any polyvagal resources that like name where does this fall or how would you explain it from a physiological process place. And so I don't have an answer for the why, but for now I just kind of classify it as like a mixed state because it's kind of a mix of how they describe all those different states, at least for me. And others might have very different experiences. My last kind of piece with that is just kind of a question to leave you with that came to me as I was looking at this. So if our body is wired to constantly assess for safety and seek connection, what's that impact going to be for a person who doesn't meet neuronormative expectations? And so I think just like being able to kind of look at it all from that polyvagal lens is really interesting. Because when I was researching some of this, there was some language that I think both Deb Dana and Porges used around like that social cues for safety piece, right? And so we know from a neurodiversity affirming stance that like people have different cues, right? That they just interpret and use differently. And so I haven't fully wrapped my brain around what all of that means or what we do with that, but I just think it's super super interesting to kind of sit with how that might make sense, and that sense of people just always feeling disconnected or rejected or unsafe with others and leading into, again, deeper conversations about masking and stuff like that. Super quickly, if you're interested in more information, and I want to give a disclaimer to that, you know, in my training, I really don't dive deep into all of this stuff that I talked about. So this was kind of I didn't want to just give you like a section of my training, right? But so this is a different approach. And so if you take my training, I'll talk about polyvagal as a resource, and I will talk about some of the trauma and some of these interactions briefly, but I don't do that. Someday, this maybe is like the first step. Someday I would like to like do a longer training about the intersections of like trauma, ADHD, kind of polyvagal theory and like putting it all together. So I do feel like having done this presentation for all of you now has my brain thinking of like that, but I will need more hours um, to prepare that and put that together. So know that that this is not like a peek into that longer training necessarily. So the one that I do offer right now is really meant to be focused on just what is the ADHD experience like for a lot of adults and kind of beyond the DSM and how we look at it right now. So I talk really specifically about executive functioning skills. For each of them, we kind of break down how does that show up for the ADHDer, how might you adapt your clinical care because of that, and what are also some strategies that you can use with your clients if you want to help them with particular executive functioning challenges. And then I also just have kind of a framework for working with adult ADHD as a whole that I've kind of put together. And so if anybody is interested, I have a live virtual training coming up in September and then one also in November. I am working towards being able to have like an on-demand option for folks that works better for. I'm hoping to have that done by the end of the year, but it's just kind of a work in progress right now. So what questions does anybody have here? I can try to do whatever we have time for. I see and I know I missed some here. Any thoughts on how to possibly help clients manufacture that dash if it is helpful in place of tactics that may create more harm? I do. So that's where so my quick response would be looking into kind of the William Dodson has the ICNU model around task initiation that he has came up with. And so that piece of that is helpful. So I is interest, challenge, novelty, and urgency. So for clients, I just kind of explain in a name that most ADHDers need one of those things to be able to task initiate. So if the task doesn't naturally include one of those things, can you hack it somehow? So for example, if I need to get my laundry done, which is not interesting, it's not challenging, it's not novel, and it's only urgent once I have no clean underwear, then the way in which I would try to do that is I could add interest to it by watching a TV show while I'm folding my laundry. If I am needing to do, the dishes, I could do them in a, maybe if I normally do it this direction, sometimes like starting backwards and doing it the opposite way makes it feel novel. I mean, that only works admittedly one time. I would also add accountability to that list. He doesn't include that, but I would add that in there. Accountability is also helpful. So body doubling seems to add a little bit of that sense of that activation and focus for a lot of people. It doesn't work for everyone. So do I have a training? So I don't have a training for like lay people yet. That is also one of those things that's in my big idea brain. It is my goal to create a few different like ADHD education programs, like online course style. Eventually, I just have not been able to get to that since I've been kind of focusing on the clinician training stuff right now. But that is a big goal that I have that would then help with some of those executive functioning skills. I don't have a list of ideas specifically for the ICNU stuff. I think there are a couple articles out there. Honestly, one of the things that I recommend for clients that's the most helpful is just